comfortable that indeed it would not have an impact on primacy or the rule package. And again, that was, some of that was hard fought with EPA in the rule package and the primacy. So we didn't want to go down that path again because that took quite some time to do. Also important to understand that the process where the highest amount of risk for liability exists during the point of injection. And there's a very robust process in the rules. They're consistent with the federal rules as it pertains to what you need to do to get to the point where you can, after you cease injection, when you get to the point where we sign off and say you're complete. And we wouldn't issue a certificate of completion until all of those requirements had been clearly satisfied. There's a provision in there that talked about 20 years is the soonest that you could apply. In reality, it's going to be much longer than 20 years, but 20 years is the soonest you can apply to that for the certificate of completion. So I just wanted to be clear on that. Now, as far as the amendments that we were tracking anyway, some of them are just clarifications. They don't really make, in my estimation, a whole lot of difference to the purpose of the bill. But when we get to page 5 and we're talking about the striking of the word "and liability," that raised a question on our end as to, you know, now you have inconsistency throughout the bill. The title of the bill is about liability. As you look through the bill, there are several other locations where you use the terms responsibility and liability, but only in this one instance are you striking liability. That creates a little bit of ambiguity in our view. We have talked to the Attorney General's office and our attorneys to determine whether or not these amendments would affect primacy or not. We don't think that they do. We're satisfied with that. However, like I said on that page 5, line 20, the striking of liability, I think, just adds ambiguity and raises questions as to, well, are we transferring the liability or not? So, and I'll stop there, and we'll take any questions that you might have.
Questions for the director?
Mr. Chairman, just going back to what Chairman Greer said, I don't know much about this at all. What is, they say after the injectors have stopped, time has passed, there's field stabilization. I didn't understand what that was, field stabilization.
So essentially, and then I'll turn it over to Ms. Sigmund if I get it wrong. But basically, it's that you no longer have any vertical or horizontal movement of the plume. So it's basically mineralized for the most part, and it's no longer moving horizontally or vertically.
Make you say it again, you're saying if the House position were adopted, the state would still retain its primacy over these injection wells. Is that right?
That's our position, yes.
Thank you.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one other thing, though. On page 6, the amendment, and I don't know the line numbering with the amendment, but that would have been at line 16. It talks about the government employees or entities being immune from liability. I think that, I guess the question is isn't that redundant? I think that provision exists elsewhere in other statutes. I don't have a specific reference, but I believe it does exist in other places.
Hey, these do work. So,
Are we on?
yeah, we're on. So Representative Stith, is that redundant to other sections of statute?
Mr. Chairman, the state generally is immune under the Governmental Claims Act unless there is a specific exception. And obviously, there's no specific statutory exception for carbon sequestration, so as it stands right now, the government's immune. Nice, so far so good. The reason for the inclusion in it was because we have language on page 5 that talked about liability, and the initial draft made it sound like the state, well, didn't, the initial draft before the amendment has the state assuming liability. And I'm not sure why Representative Greer believes what he does. I'd like to ask him, but to me, if you assume liability, you're waiving your sovereign immunity as soon as you do that. So the policy question is, 20 years go by, something bad happens. Is there any relief for anybody? Under the Senate position, the government has, frankly, what appears to be unlimited liability. Under the House position, no one's liable for anything. And maybe both of those positions are not fair. Maybe both of those positions. And my proposal is, and I've got an amendment drafted up here, that would reinsert and leave back in the original language on page 5, saying that in exchange for assuming responsibility and liability and so on. So we relieve that original language, but then we say whatever liability the government's going to have is going to be the same as the limits of liability in our Governmental Claims Act for ordinary torts, which currently is $250,000 per occurrence. So that's what I think is sort of a fair, potential fair compromise on this.
Yes.
And I don't know the language, but the concept, I think, is consistent with what I think we should probably do, which is make sure that it's clear that we are assuming liability, but that there is a limit to the magnitude of that liability we assume, where I don't think that's what it does now. As you pointed out, it basically says, nope, not us, where having the cap, I think, is far more consistent with probably accomplishing something.
I think the director has some.
Todd, you got some input on that?
Yeah, just to direct everybody's attention to page 14, and to remind everybody, there is a special revenue account. And that special revenue account is something that is paid through a fee to the operator over time. And it covers things like testing and monitoring, long-term inspections, remediation of mechanical problems, plugging and abandoning monitoring wells, and all future claims associated with the release of carbon dioxide from the sequestration sites. So I just wanted to point that out.
So that would not be limited to $250,000. That'd be limited to whatever's in the account.
That's right.
Yeah.
Is that contemplated? Is that contemplated in the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, this proposed amendment would work independently of this reserve account. Presumably, this account is going to be the source of funding of the payment, presumably. However, you can imagine a scenario where there's a lot more money in the account, or you can imagine a scenario where there's almost no money in the account. You could, I suppose, limit the claims to the $250,000 per, to any claimant, and $500,000 in the aggregate, and make, or the amount that's in this reserve account, whichever is less. You could do that, but I don't think you have to tie them together. I think it's just more likely than not that when push comes to shove, this account would be the one that would be used to pay the claims, right?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Quick question. Director, on orphaned and abandoned wells, where we have a fund kind of in the same concept at least, that is funded through effectively paid in fees, and we can use those funds. It's in the OGCC, I think, instead of in DEQ, but it's not a liability waiver, it's a responsibility fund. I realize that most of the time it's not a single action over $250,000, but do you have a sense of how that's structured? Because we assume the liability effectively for the orphaned and abandoned wells. We assume that liability. We have a fund available for it, and I don't think we contemplate that as a waiver of liability for the state or anything going to the Government Claims Act. We have a responsible fund, and it's effectively subject to availability of those funds. That seems like a more appropriate model here, where fund availability should be the first determination, and then beyond that, maybe we have a cap on liability. But How is that done? And I realize it's an ODCC, so you may not know the details.
Yeah, I don't know how exactly the Oil and Gas Commission does that, so
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to answer that.
Representative Greer, do you have something to add?
I mean, the issue is finding a responsible party with the oil and gas council. So industry as a whole pays in
Right.
tax. Half the tax goes towards operating the commission, the other half is there for basically P&A remediation, primarily P&A activities. And it's a matter of the responsible party. So what happens if the bonds for plugging and abandoning aren't high enough, or the party goes away and the bonds are used and they're not enough, then that's where that fund comes into practice. And the industry has been, in the oil and gas sector anyway, has been adamant. If you recall, the Minerals Committee was gonna look at adding general funds to help with the P&A activities in the Powder River Basin associated with coal bed methane. And they said, no, we'll do this as an industry with it. So
Yeah.
it's a little different scenario.
Well, but Chairman Greer, though, I mean, the legal structure of it is kind of similar because I'm pretty sure that's a state account. We're receiving the fees into a state account, and then the state has an obligation, a responsibility. That we effectively have the liability for those abandoned and orphaned wells. I just don't know what the legal structure, maybe nobody cared when that was being written because it's not the same magnitude of unknown risk.
Well, an operator in that scenario could just leave or go bankrupt or be.
Right.
And then all that was left is the bond. We're talking about post work, right? Certificate of completion means the formation is plugged and then gonna be monitored a long time. And we're looking at liability for what we don't know. And we're setting up a fund with this, a revenue fund, to be proactive, to have something available for what we don't
Right.
know, which is, in my mind, visionary.
To some degree, though, I think that's similar, Mr. Chairman, because what you have is a circumstance where you're paying in for the ongoing maintenance, that's part of it, and monitoring once the state assumes liability, and then there's the possibility of unknown liability that we need to contemplate. With orphaned and abandoned wells, you have a similar circumstance. You have bonds. The bonds might not be sufficient. They've been paying in, and then you have a fund that you can address. So maybe the orders of magnitude aren't the same, but I thought the legal structure might be similar. But honestly, it just might not have shown up in statute. Maybe nobody cared because the potential liability, the unknowns weren't enough to work through it.
I think the paragraph 4 on page 14 there on line 12 says it all. It says this thing says funds in the account can be used only for all future claims associated with the release of carbon dioxide from the geologic sequestration sites. So we have this fund set up to take care of that. I don't think we ought to go into the governmental liability part and say, that's all we're gonna do. What we're gonna do is use these accounts for that claim.
What if, Mr. Chairman, what if you backstopped so you had this account as the primary, and you basically say that it's subject to availability of funds in this primary account, and then no claim beyond this account shall exceed our obligation under the Government Claims Act?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I don't know that it makes any difference. And the reason is that I think that the bonding is very similar to insurance, and ultimately, under the Government Claims Act, you only waive liability to the extent of the insurance. And so to the extent that there's funds in here, I think that that's what it is. Other than that, the governmental liability applies. So if you go back and you go to, for example, you go out to one of your county's municipalities, lots of them, some of our county hospitals have life insurance, they have, not life insurance, they have O&E, errors and omissions, they have negligence, they have various insurance for those things. And to the extent that exceeds the governmental waiver, they've waived it to the extent of those, and I think this works exactly the same way. Okay. And if that's, if I look at Chairman Greer, and if he nods, one there shakes his head.
So Do
He
we
was
need more
just- he was just
clarification, or do you
falling
think the
off
language works
asleep.
that way by default?
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah, so I
It
mean,
uses this fund, and then the default is the limits.
So then we would have, we use this fund on page 14, but you also add in that the liability on a given claim is not going to exceed the limits we've got in the Government Claims Act. Does that work for everybody?
No, this fund might have $1 million in it that we would expend for that. But after we expended that, then it would, it would kick in. But we're not gonna limit the expenditure of this fund to 250.
Chairman Anderson?
Yes.
I would just point out, what if there are 4 entities that, that do sequester and they pay significant fees that are in there? And so they use the field for, or the aquifer strata, I guess, if they're not using the aquifer, but anyway, for, you know, for 15, 20 years. And then they get their certificate of completion, they plug, it's monitored, 20 years goes by. And something were to tie back to one of them, you might take all the funds out on one incident. And so with what Representative Stiff's saying might be worth considering.
The challenge there, though, is there's going to have to be a fix. If something is broken and the cost of the fix is $500,000 and the state says, well, I'm sorry, 250 was our limit, what happens?
And that's what the injector is worried about. If you limit your liability, who does that fall back on? Supposedly you release me, but I know who you're coming back on.
I very much like the way the bill came out of the Senate, for the record.
so,
I feel good about it.
Well, you can't know how much that means to us.
so, Mr. Chairman? So,
Representative Greer, yeah.
Mr.
Does anybody have a fix for this? Yes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that, you know, at the end of the, so the question is how much to worry about events that are probably at least 50 years into the future?
Yeah.
You've got the entire injection period.
We come back to that key issue. Is the assumption of the liability waiver of sovereignty? That's the key issue.
Yeah.
So when you come in, you set up the revenue fund, right? You just say that the liability by Wyoming is limited to the amount of that fund. And I think maybe Chairman Anderson, that's what you're saying, is just put a savings clause in that respect, to that effect.
Hey,
Mr.
are you
Chairman, so
done?
that-
Were you done, Senator?
The only thing I have is going to complicate the issue, so I'll just keep my mouth shut.
Oh, good.
Mr.
Oh, good. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, that would be,
Yes.
it would be a very simple fix, I suppose, is you delete the House amendment, and then wherever appropriate, you just say that the liability of the state is limited to whatever the balance of the fund is.
Why couldn't we put that right in that line, that paragraph 4?
On
On
page
future
four-
claims
page
associated
14?
with blah, blah, blah,
page
blah, blah.
14?
On page 14.
You could do that,
Could we put it right there?
right? That doesn't make,
We don't need to go back on page 5, do we? Or
you
6?
you could leave everything else the same
Yeah, yeah.
and say that, you'd have to have some language that just say that the liability of the state, its employees, et cetera, acting within the scope of their duties, shall be no greater than the balance of the fund at any time. You could do that. I mean, that's a simple amendment that, you know, is a bit ugly because it creates the potential that the first claimant gets $5 million and the second claimant gets $15, but it's a solution. If you don't
Well,
like,
we've got 40 years to work on it, so,
Mr. Chairman?
yes.
I think that our thinking out loud has engendered a thought
Oh,
or two
okay.
by our good regulators.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just one point I want to add about the special revenue account. It includes the per ton injection fee that we're envisioning that the injector will pay during the time they are injecting. When they get ready to close the site, they will need to submit a cost estimate to us that looks at what they think will be needed for long-term care of the site, the monitoring, measuring, verification. We will take a look at that, and if the injection fee amount that they have put in over the number of years they've been injecting is deficient, we will require additional payment at that time. So it is a per ton injection fee each year, but just know that we also do take a look at the end of the project at what we think will be needed for long-term care, and if the funds are insufficient in the account, we will ask for additional funding at that time before we close the project.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman?
yes.
I'm satisfied at this time with limiting the liability of the state to the value of that fund, because I think it's a good way forward. I don't know if that ends up being the final answer, because I do still have concerns about, all right, well, who's on the hook then if there is a $10 million cost or something in the future? Nobody's liable, so everyone just looks the other way.
Don't forget it's an asset.
Yeah.
It's an asset.
Yeah, true.
Director Parfit, and
Stiff.
ma'am, I do have a question about, would you be concerned that if the liability to a claimant could eat up the entire fund, that you would then not have funds for remediation of other sites?
Mr. Chairman, I think, given the fact, as Director Parfit has explained, that the highest risk occurs during injection. By the time we get to site closure, if our regulatory process has been followed, risk should be minimal after that point. I feel that that, in combination with the special revenue account and the fact that in addition to the per ton injection fee, we will be taking a very close look at each project before we close it, at what funds might be needed. I think it likely that that special revenue account fund would encompass the needs that we have for any long-term care of that site.
Yes, Senator. Go ahead. Go ahead. Here.
There it goes. Just you have to press it apparently 6 times.
Yeah.
And just on that point, I mean, you've got monitoring wells, you've scoped out, I mean, you knew at the time that the injection started, you've scoped out the scope of the field, you know where the pore space boundaries are, you know all those things, and you've been monitoring those things for probably in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 years, however long the injection period lasts, maybe 10, 20, 30 years, then another 20 years on the back of that before you can even apply for this permit. So you've been monitoring the movements, you know where this is, and at that point, I mean, this stuff is no longer gas. Once you're, my understanding is once you're below 3,000 feet, something like that, it's back to a liquid form. And so you're able to monitor this stuff. It's not ethereal, it's only gonna, and once you're not pressuring that formation anymore, there was no reason for this to move other than just natural forces of gravity or other pressures that occur within the field. And you'll have 20 years to figure that out before they can even apply of monitoring and so those are all things that happen before you ever get to the permitted closure, before this liability question even ever enters into it. I think the other thing that would be is they've made a number of warranties with respect to when they apply that the closure plan's been followed, that everything's been done. There's been some supervision and oversight with respect to compliance with the plugging plan. And ultimately, if there's an error, there's either a breach of that warranty or it's not as advertised, I don't think it doesn't matter. The liability doesn't transfer because they've lied. They ruined the warranty, and there is a statute of limitations sort of that, but I think you're subject to what's called the discovery rule. Means I don't think that, and if it turns out that they've lied or they haven't done what they said they did and they weren't caught, I don't know that liability is not going to go away. You're still going to be able to pull back in the injector if they haven't done what they said they would do. I think that's my belief. So.
All right, is somebody going to write this up? I don't know if we ought to turn it over to Representative Stith. He kind of got to us on that last one.
Brian,
Are we at
So
the,
what are we writing up?
so let's
Well, he hasn't.
go to Brian.
Brian, do you have what we're going to write up?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, my understanding is we would delete House Third Reading Amendment number 2 entirely. And then the only place that I was unclear is the place you wanted to put this. But basically, one example would be page 5, lines 20 to 22, on line 22 after state, provided that the liability shall not exceed the amount in the account and I'll put the appropriate statutory reference.
Yeah,
And I was thinking on page 14, actually.
no, I think he,
But is page 5 better?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think he nailed it.
Okay. All right. So you got it?
Yep, so Mr. Chairman, I will write that up, and then if one of you, whoever wants to run herd on this, I'll give the JCC that you'll need to take around to each of the 6 of you to be signed. So I just need a volunteer for that.
Yeah, that's what we usually do. Usually it's the chairman and the chairman that does that. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything else to come before this concurrence?
Go team.
All right.
Go back to work.